Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapter 1105 is short and sweet, but leaves us on a very interesting cliffhanger that could have some big ramifications for the rest of the arc. So in this breakdown, I'll be going into the why and how behind each possible person or group heading for Egghead, as well as the potential return of Luffy's Tank Man form, Brook's curious knowledge of pyroblane physics, and much, much more. So stay tuned. But really quick, around 90% of people who watch my channel are still not subscribed. So if you've enjoyed any of my videos, such as the in-depth live-action breakdowns, the weekly manga breakdowns, or more recently my breakdowns of the anime adaptation of Monsters, I would really appreciate if you hit that subscribe button. It helps to support me and grow the channel, and you'll be able to get my videos as soon as they come out. Now with all of that said, let's get into chapter 1105, The Height of Folly. We open on the Marines evacuating the island and then see Dahl between two other vice admirals, one with the sea otter devil fruit who we saw fighting Bonnie earlier, and the one with the large beard who we saw aiming at Bonnie when she was captured by Saturn. Last we had seen Dahl, she along with the long-haired vice admiral were expressing shock at Saturn's presence on the island. Here, she urges Kizaru and Saturn to flee the island, but Kizaru coldly dismisses her. Also of note, she addresses Kizaru by his given name, Borsalino, so I'm unsure if this is supposed to convey some sort of closeness or familiarity here. Vegapunk contests against Saturn's arrogant decision to destroy the island instead of just taking Vegapunk's life, but Saturn reasons that he's doing this in order to make sure there's nothing that Vegapunk can hide from him to use against the world government. As we saw in the last chapter, Vegapunk had defied Saturn's orders to implement a self-destruct mechanism in Kuma, opting for a shutdown protocol instead, and Saturn has pretty good reason to think Vegapunk would be keeping more secrets from him, as we know there is actually a government-defying giant robot hidden somewhere on the island that should probably come into the story relatively soon, as we last saw it activate over 10 chapters ago. Saturn informs Vegapunk that he had ordered the evacuated people to be killed as well. Shaka had wanted the researchers to evacuate back when CP0 first arrived on the island, and we soon saw them evacuate to the Fabio phase inside the factory. There, we would see Sentomaru inform them of the island's impending doom about 10 chapters later, and see them finally evacuating off of the island in 1079, just before we cut away from the events on the first day of Egghead. This was also around the same time that the Blackbeard Pirates ship had entered Egghead's vicinity, which I'll talk more about in just a bit. When we return to Egghead on the following day is when we first saw Saturn give this order to have them killed. We see the same ship we saw in 1079 destroyed here, but of course, this is just a visual representation of the order and not the actual truth, as we would come to find out at the end of the chapter. The Ohara parallels are very blatant in this arc, but thankfully, it seems some things are panning out differently, as the evacuated civilian ship did not make it out of the Ohara incident, but it may have here. Saturn scolds Vegapunk for his forbidden research and blames it on the scientist's greed. Now, we have seen Vegapunk's self-indulgence end up causing greater problems down the line on several occasions, such as his decision to assist the world government, putting him directly under their scrutiny and control, or his use of Kuma's body for his human weapons project, resulting in a lifetime of tragedy for Kuma and Bonnie. Not only that, his decision to isolate parts of his personality would give birth to York, who not only embodied, but arguably magnified the worst part of Vegapunk's avarice, and as such, York being Vegapunk's manifest greed would go on to be the catalyst for this very incident that he finds himself in. While we see the Marines evacuate, we get some communications between the various ships. During the buster call on Enia's lobby, we had seen a naming convention with the 10 battleships being numbered, so it's interesting to see a similar one used here, despite the 100 ships having not been initially coordinated for a buster call. While all of this is going on, we finally get an update on the status of the entire crew. We haven't seen most of the Straw Hats since 1094, but even back then, we weren't certain what was going on with some of them, so let's get into it. Atlas, Frankie, Kuma, and Bonnie head for the vacuum rocket, while Sanji decides to stay back and help Vegapunk. It's good to see Frankie is seemingly fine after the previous chapter, where he received a light speed kick to his weak spot, his back. It's also a bit funny that Atlas is carrying Kuma similarly to how Jinbei had to carry Atlas in the earlier part of the arc. We cut over to the Labo phase, where we're seeing the rear exit to the lab for the first time. We last saw this group back in 1094, when they were rushing out of the lab with someone on a stretcher. At the time, we thought this person to be Stussy, after being injured from intercepting a finger pistol from Lucci that was meant for Vegapunk, and this was because she was portrayed with a light hair color. However, it seems that Oda had simply forgotten to color her hair and jacket in that panel, because this is actually Robin. Now that's a big relief, because there had been a lot of speculation on what Robin was up to and whether or not she was in danger, with this being her third buster call. and she doesn't seem very pleased with this news either. There's been a lot of wild theories about Robin being kidnapped by the Blackbeard Pirates or being impersonated with Katarina Devon's abilities, and I don't think this is the case, but I will note for good measure that she's missing a bandage on her forehead, but I wouldn't look too much into this. Edison is with them, having last been seen allowing Atlas, Vegapunk, Frankie, and Sanji through the Frontier Dome, and we learn that Jinbei has been sent to help Zoro with his fight against Lucci in case he ends up getting lost. We had last seen Jinbei moving Vegapunk's equipment from the second floor of Building A to the rear exit, and in case you forgot, this is where Vegapunk grew his lab-grown organs. Recall that the escape plan was to move the Sunny to the backside of the island in order to be carried away by the Vega Force 1, but unfortunately, that was destroyed by Kizaru. If only there were another giant robot capable of helping our crew escape. Speaking of giant robots, last we saw Lilith, she was supposed to be moving Sunny using the General Frankie, but it looks Brook has come to her aid with that. We haven't seen Brook since he was trying to fight off Kizaru back inside the lab, and if you've been watching my breakdowns, you know that my recurring grievance with this arc is how little screen time Brook has gotten, so I'm ecstatic to see him getting to do anything of relevance. And what he does here is actually pretty interesting, as it seems he's frozen the island clouds in order to allow the Sunny to move across them. If you recall, when Pyrobloin comes into contact with moisture in the air, they form island clouds and sea clouds, depending on their given density. Now this is normally only possible high up in the sky, but thanks to the controlled climate of Egghead, these types of clouds can exist down here at ocean level. Brook seems to have been able to alter the density of the pyrobloin on the island clouds by freezing them, allowing the Sunny to effectively sail atop it. Now this is likely because freezing water causes a decrease in density, which is why ice cubes tend to float in your drink. As such, Brook has lowered the density of moisture in the island cloud, causing it to behave a bit more like a sea cloud. Now who would have thought that it would take this long to get some actual real tangible science in this arc? With that said, it is very interesting to me that Brook was savvy enough to do this. I have to wonder if he has some prior experience with Sky Islands. I'm a firm believer that Oda has been using Brook as a character very conservatively throughout the series, as he may have a wealth of information that could answer too many questions if addressed too soon. After all, he is 90 years old, meaning he's lived through most of the last century's worth of events, even before Roger's era, including when the Rocks Pirates ruled the sea, so I'm looking forward to more of Brook in the future. For now, it seems they don't have a great way to stop the ship or revert the density of the moisture in the clouds, which will likely cause them to fall down below to the Fabrio phase. Unless, of course, they're caught by the Iron Giant that we've been waiting to mobilize forever. A bit later in this chapter, we also learned that Luffy, who had seemingly disappeared last chapter, was actually in front of the automated cooking machine this whole time. I speculated that the food was more than likely coming from here back in my 1103 breakdown, and at the time, I wasn't super fond of the idea that it was Caribou who was providing this food, even thinking that between the two candidates, Kizaru was more likely, but I'm glad that Luffy seemingly acquired this food by himself, perhaps having just reached over for the machine when he was in his weakened state. Given Luffy's current situation, I wonder if we'll finally be able to see the return of Tank Man. The first and last time we saw this was during the Whole Cake Island arc, when Luffy was fighting against Cracker by devouring his seemingly endless army of biscuit soldiers. He was stuffed much like he is here, but he was able to make use of this body shape by entering Gear 4th. Of note, this was said to be the stuffed version, so we haven't actually seen the true Tank Man just yet. Perhaps Luffy will be able to make use of his large surface area in order to save Kuma, Bonnie, Atlas, and Frankie, who are left falling out of the sky as the chapter ends. Now, that's all of the Straw Hats and Vegapunks accounted for, except York. Last we saw her, she was still restrained on the ground of the lab, so she presumably was left behind. I had some hopes that the Straw Hats would continue taking her hostage to keep the world government from creating more Mother Flame, but perhaps they don't care for that much at all. We also don't know what's going on with both Stussy and Kaku. We haven't seen either of them since 1092, when she blocked Lucci's finger pistol, and when Kaku was placed inside a bubble prison by Sanji. Could the Straw Hats really have left the two of them behind alongside York? There's also Hattori, who was last seen in the lab when Lucci made a sneak attack. I have to wonder if this is going to be Hattori's time to shine, by popping the bubble Kaku's imprisoned in, allowing him to retrieve York and escape the island. Of course, the bubbles are very resilient, but either way, something is going to have to be done with the Frontier Dome as it's still at 100%. And this brings us back to the coast, where we see several battleships taking aim at the island, with the Vice Admiral with the Sea Otter Devil Fruit leading the charge. Vegapunk is forced to watch as the scientific achievements are destroyed one after the other, and you've got to wonder, what becomes of him and the satellites when Punk Records is actually destroyed? And what of the Labo phase if the island AC is damaged, causing the island clouds to dissipate and the Labo phase to crash down? Whatever happens, it's not going to be pretty. Meanwhile, Frankie's group has made it onto the vacuum rocket, much to his amusement, and I love that Frankie can still find enjoyment in Vegapunk's technology, even amidst a life-threatening event like this one. The automated voice tells us the travel time between the Fabrio phase and the Labo phase is 32 seconds, and we saw this once before when Luffy's group used the vacuum rocket earlier in the arc. Also of note, they had announced all subsequent trips were cancelled after that. A small hiccup, I suppose, but it can be easily explained by one of the Vegapunks making it active once again. But I think this will be the last time anyone will be able to make use of it, as Kizaru slices the tube and ends up destroying the hyper capsule, or should I say capsule, as it's now spelled in the lower panel. It's also somewhat funny that this is the second time in this arc that Kizaru has thwarted Frankie, Atlas, and Bonnie's escape by destroying their path and vehicle within a span of a couple of chapters. Sanji starts to head up to catch them while Saturn mobilizes the Pacifista to shoot Bonnie and Kuma out of the sky. We see these sonar-like rings depicted with the Pacifista, and this is likely their supersonic hearing that we learned Kuma had a few chapters back. We've seen these a few times earlier in the arc as well, but we weren't explicitly aware that Kuma had this feature until that flashback. Now this is why the Pacifista have been able to receive orders despite Saturn being nowhere near them. Here, the Pacifista are mostly stationed around the coast of the island as we saw throughout this chapter, while Saturn is toward the center of the Fabrio phase. Also, really quick, a nice touch that Oda included, some of these ships that were destroyed by the Mecha Sea Beasts earlier in the arc are here as well. Both Vegapunk and Saturn have their own internal monologues here, with Saturn reveling in the twisted irony of the situation, while Vegapunk is horrified by it. Vegapunk's verbiage here reminds me a lot of a certain line from Sentomaru earlier in this arc that really stuck out to me. Back when Sentomaru mobilized the Mark III Pacifista, he didn't order them to ensure Vegapunk's safety, but rather their creators, and this always felt so peculiar to me. On one hand, this is a much more dramatic way of giving that order, but on the other, this is a very specific way of writing the line, infusing it with what almost feels like unnecessary ambiguity over who the creator is supposed to be. I've always wondered if there was supposed to be a twist here. Now, I've spoken about this before on this channel, but back in Sabaody, Kuma is able to order PX-1 to wait, and the Pacifista complies. At the time, Oda probably did not have the entirety of the authority hierarchy figured out just yet, but it made me wonder if Kuma somehow has the greatest authority over his own clones, unbeknownst to anyone, even himself. So, if there's anything going on here, then perhaps this is the opportunity for us to see it. Last chapter, I had wondered if we were supposed to understand Kuma as dead, since his palms no longer had the pads from his fruit, but it seems that may have just been an error by Oda as Kuma grabs onto Bonnie here, protecting her from the incoming danger. It appears Kuma may only be able to act when Bonnie is specifically in danger, which explains why he stopped functioning after knocking Saturn away in the previous chapter. This lends a bit more credence to the idea that Kuma started moving after he heard Bonnie was under threat of being killed by CP0, and the only way for him to have known this is if somehow he was privy to the information of his clone, S-Bear, who was right by CP0 at the time. It'll be a lot of fun to see how they get saved. Will Kuma be able to use his powers to teleport them? Is this when the giant robot comes into play? Maybe Luffy saves them, or maybe Gear 5th inspires something in Kuma and Bonnie, and perhaps we'll get the Sanji vs Kizaru matchup that we first saw in that opening. There are a ton of questions to be had, and as if that wasn't enough, we are hit with another huge question with the final panel showing the remains of the ship sent after the previously discussed evacuated ship. It seems this happened pretty recently as they still need to report back to Kizaru about it and express to him that someone's coming to Egghead. Now, who could this be referring to? Well, for the rest of the video, I'm going to be talking about every possible candidate and taking a deep dive into the logic behind each possibility. But before we get into it, I want to lay out some preliminary pieces of information that'll inform the reasoning for each of these possibilities. The researchers' ship set sail yesterday, while the Marine's ship was sent out after it today, which would suggest that there's a great bit of distance between the two. Granted, Doberman had said they knew the coordinates of the researcher's ship, but that does not necessitate that the Marine ship had made it to the researcher's ship by the time the Marine ship was destroyed. As such, there is no clear indication that whoever destroyed the Marine ship was doing so with the intention of protecting the researcher's ship, nor does it mean they even knew the researcher's ship was a factor at all. They could have very well engaged with the Marine ship for other reasons, so saving the researchers may or may not have been incidental. All we can say for certain is the Marine ship failed to get rid of the researchers. And because of this, we can't say for sure whether or not whoever is coming to Egghead is on the way because of the Straw Hats. The details of the Straw Hats being on Egghead only became public to the world as of the current day thanks to the newspaper, which somewhat suggests that whoever was on their way was either already heading for Egghead or was close enough to be able to start for the island within a day's notice. Now, with that said, let's get into the possibilities. The Blackbeard Pirates have been a wild card in this arc for a while now, with one of their ships making its way to Egghead just before we cut away the previous day. Since most of the crew was split up between Fololed and Winter Island, the only two unaccounted for members would be Katarina Devon and Lafitte. The ship is unlikely to have stayed overnight into the present day, considering the island has been surrounded by 100 marine ships. And I have doubts that either Devon or Lafitte would have made their way to the island and stuck around that whole time either. Considering that Blackbeard has had a goal of wanting to become part of the world government, it doesn't quite make sense to me that he would send his forces to a government island like Egghead unprompted. His plan was to make use of Kobe as a bargaining chip, and he arguably has a better one now with Garp as his hostage, so potentially ruining his chances by raiding or plundering Egghead does not seem likely to me. The Blackbeard Pirates would need a reason to go to Egghead, and for a while now, I've been wondering if that's Caribou. Caribou has been wanting to leave the island since they arrived, and as we know, he has someone he wants to provide information about the ancient weapons to. We've previously seen Lafitte involved in picking up other crewmates, such as when he along with Shiryu went to Dressrosa to retrieve Burgess. So it's not impossible that Caribou had reached out to the Blackbeard Pirates for a pickup. When we first see the Blackbeard Pirates approaching, we actually see the researchers board the evacuating ship just before. There's also some chance that Caribou ended up escaping the island via the evacuated researchers ship, and that's why the Blackbeard Pirates would have to leave Egghead before returning to take advantage of the ensuing chaos on the island. There probably are a few ways for this to play out, though because the ship left yesterday, there would need to be some explanation for why the Blackbeard Pirates took so long to come back toward Egghead and what they even want to do here, though I'm sure it's possible Caribou came across various valuable things for them to take. Another way for this to make sense is that Lafitte and Devon's ship never went to the researchers after all, and Caribou's still on the island, but they simply moved their ship further away from Egghead since it would be found among the marine fleet, and perhaps that's how they came across the marine ship sent to go after the researchers, and they're now heading back to retrieve Caribou amidst all the chaos. We'll have to see. I suppose there's also the possibility that this is any of the other Blackbeard Pirates as well, since this is taking place the day after the events of Fololed and Winter Island. While Winter is the furthest distance from Egghead, Fololed is close enough. We saw Garp was able to make his way from G14 to Fololed in a relatively short amount of time, and since G14 is very close to Egghead, then it tracks that anyone on Fololed would be able to get to Egghead within a day's notice. And that said, there are some very interesting connections for Kuzan's presence here in particular, as he's the only once admiral who was both at the Buster Call of Ohara and the Buster Call of Enya's lobby. Now there's also a chance that this could be the work of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet. When they were first formed, the narrator had told us that they would eventually cause a great incident of historic proportions, and this more or less lines up with what they had said about the Egghead incident earlier in this arc. I suppose the one distinction in verbiage that may matter here is that the Grand Fleet did not cause the Egghead incident by any means, but their involvement in it would definitely impact the outcome of it. Now, the last we saw most of them was during the Grand Fleet cover story, which took place before the reverie with the various crews scattered around the New World. Donsai and Leo had attended the reverie, but that took place over a month ago, and as such, there's been plenty of time for the Grand Fleet to have made their way to the Straw Hats since then, as they said they would should anything happen. We know the Grand Fleet has Luffy's V-Ray card, and it's not unlikely they started heading in this direction during the several occasions on Onigashima when Luffy's life was in serious danger. If they started toward Luffy during their raid on Onigashima, that would give them at least 2 weeks time to get in the general area of Wano, and they could reasonably be within a day's distance of Egghead should they have continued following Luffy's direction after the Straw Hats left Wano. Plus, they would have been able to receive the current day's newspaper and learn even more about the specifics of the Straw Hat situation. I don't know if this includes all of the Grand Fleet members though, because we had seen Shanks express his desire to deal with Bartolomeo for attacking the Red Hair Pirates' territory. It's unsure what ended up happening with that, as we last saw Shanks on Elbaf just yesterday, where he was trying to set sail. Either way, I think it's pretty reasonable for the Grand Fleet to come into play here. It's also not completely out of the realm of possibility that the Revolutionary Army, or at least some of its members, would be on their way to Egghead. The destruction of Ohara was a big reason for the formation of the Revolutionary Army, and so it would make sense for them to want to prevent the destruction of Egghead. That said, the Buster Call was just announced recently. But even so, I don't think many of the major members of the Revolutionary Army would have been able to make their way from Kamabaka Queendom in Paradise over to Egghead in the New World in such a short span of time. Kuma left sometime yesterday before Sabo arrived and only made it to Egghead not too long ago in the present day. Sure, there was some amount of time scaling the Red Line, but he traveled via air, which surely sped up the journey. Besides that, last we saw Dragon and Ivankov was earlier in the present day as part of a montage of people across the world reacting to the newspaper headlines that was first told to us by the narrator during the previous day. The only other member we can make out is Morley in the background, and we had last seen Karasu, Lindbergh, and Belobetti during the day prior when Sabo arrived. So if any major representatives of the revolutionaries were to arrive on Egghead in the present day, it would likely be amongst Sabo, Karasu, Lindbergh, and Belobetti. But this is only under the condition that they have some means of crossing the Red Line and getting to Egghead from halfway across the world within a day or so's time. which may be possible with Karasu's Soot abilities, as we have seen them used for air travel. So given all of this, I would imagine that Karasu and some combination of Sabo, Lindbergh, and Belobedi were mobilized toward Egghead on the previous day, not necessarily for the purpose of tracking Kuma, as we only saw Ivankov and Dragon approach the conclusion of him going to Egghead in the present day, nor for the purpose of preventing a Buster Call, since that was only put into action recently, but rather to follow up on Shaka's premonition of his own death, which he divulged to Dragon yesterday as the Straw Hats arrived on Egghead. There are also a few other third parties that may have some interest in being at Egghead. For example, Miss Buckin had asserted that Vegapunk would be able to prove to Marco that Weevil is related to Whitebeard. The red-haired pirates had dropped Marco off near Sphinx before they went off to Elbath, and this was some days before the Straw Hats arrived on Egghead. This conversation between Buckin and Marco is seemingly taking place yesterday, and with Marco's flight abilities, it wouldn't be too far-fetched to see how they'd be able to make it to Egghead in time. There's also Neo-Mads. During the last cover story, we saw Caesar and Judge combine forces to form Neo-Mads, and they had come to the realization that all of their problems stemmed from Vegapunk, so they could understandably have some motivation to seek them out. The cover story looked to be taking place soon after the events of the Whole Cake Island arc, which was over a month ago at this point in the present day, so there's plenty of time for them to have made their way toward Egghead. There's also been speculation that Morgans alongside Vivi and Wapol were also headed for the island, as we had last seen them when we returned to Egghead, with them listening in on the call between the Five Elders and York. Since Morgans and his ship travels by air, it's not impossible for them to make their way to Egghead in a reasonable amount of time, though the motive for it is curious. One may assume it's to do proper coverage of the situation. I should note that Morgans had received a scoop from somebody about the Egghead situation, and it doesn't seem to be the work of the world government themselves, as we saw Saturn approve of the headline the following day upon reading it. I talked about this during my Egghead recap video from months ago, and then I speculated his informant to perhaps be Stussy, since they had seemed to be somewhat good friends. However, it's also possible that the person Caribou has been needing to report back to all this time is in truth Morgans, so we'll just have to see how that goes. There are other options that I think are less likely, but I suppose we can't rule them out. Cross Guild, for example, may have some interest in the Straw Hats or Egghead. There had been theories that Caribou was actually reporting to Crocodile, so I suppose that may provide some motive if Caribou had escaped on that evacuated ship. There's also some belief that Burnscar could be coming into the fray. I've seen people compare the shipwreck here to the one we saw when Lafitte was discussing his powers, but I don't know if there's that much to go off on here. We also haven't seen Smoker in a long while, having last seen him alongside Toshigi on their way to Egghead with the kids from Punk Hazard. We know the kids had already received medical care and now have been moved to G14 under Toshigi's care, which leaves Smoker's role in the story a bit up in the air. I've been anticipating him to have some role in this arc, but I don't know that he would necessarily destroy a fellow Marine ship. I personally hope he may have met up with Fujitora, as we had seen them have some sort of like-minded relationship before. There's always speculation with these things that Shanks is on his way, but he seemed to have left Elbath yesterday, and as mentioned before, probably still has to deal with Bartolomeo. As such, I doubt we'll get his presence here. There are other fringe possibilities as well, I suppose, like Law and Beppo having made their way somehow, or perhaps even Kid, but I don't think we'll see those two again so soon, perhaps in the next arc. I'm sure there are a bunch more possibilities, so if there's any that you've been hoping for, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. That's all about it for all the big things that I wanted to talk about in this chapter, and I'm interested in hearing what you all thought. If you enjoyed my breakdown of this chapter, be sure to subscribe. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.